Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Temple and the Lodge, the strange and fascinating history of the Knights Templar and the Freemasons, by Michael Baigent and Richard Leigh. Foreword by Mitch Horowitz. Narrated by Rick Adamson. Foreword. Esoteric History and Our History. Rediscovering the Temple and the Lodge. I originally encountered the Temple and the Lodge during my first job in publishing in 1989. I was asked to prepare a reader's report on whether the book would make a good paperback reprint. I didn't get it. Like many young people, I entered the world of literature with almost no understanding of, and even less interest in, Freemasonry, Knights Templar, and esoteric philosophies. I do not recall such topics ever coming up in college. More than a decade later, when I began my own journey into chronicling occult history, you can never foresee your path, Michael Baigent and Richard Leigh's book returned to me with new relevance, and the authors themselves returned to bestseller lists, famous for their earlier work, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which contributed to the historical template of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Our culture seems to thrive on a process of embrace and backlash, and this cycle played out in the careers of Baigent and Leigh. Following the 2003 publication of Brown's novel, Baigent and Leigh were, for a time, feted, widely read, and discussed, and then came the acts of counter-criticism, accusing them of historical fallacies and speculations. The writers sued Brown's publisher for copyright infringement, claiming the Da Vinci Code appropriated the architecture of their work. They lost, incurring millions in legal debt. It is my hope that this new publication of The Temple and the Lodge properly returns the reading public's gaze to where it belongs, the intrepid historicism and investigatory skills of these now-deceased authors. Leigh passed in 2007 and Baigent in 2013. It is unnecessary to agree with all of the author's historical suppositions, I do not, to recognize their prowess as researchers. Very few of the bloggers and knights of Wikipedia who rush to label Baigent and Leigh's work as speculative history recognize or possess the author's documentary skills and grasp of detail. Were the pair alive, I think they would like the label investigative history. In my not-quite-Solomonic effort, I call their work theoretical history. Baigent and Leigh's historicism necessarily incorporates their own, often spiritedly argued theses, but it is important to note that the authors were not insistent in tone and openly acknowledged their uncertainties, a vanishing trait in today's culture. The pair brought prodigious effort and field work to the Temple and the Lodge, which explores the survival of esoteric thought systems, in particular the origins of modern Freemasonry within the Knights Templar, a martial and banking order brutally suppressed by the Vatican in the early 14th century. Freemasonry is itself profoundly uncertain of its own origins, the authors note. That important point fuels investigations like this one. When approaching esoteric history, few maps exist. The seeker is his own cartographer. Baigent and Leigh approached this challenge with poise and dedication, if not always in a manner bound to settle arguments. Although I write as a historian who shares the author's Masonic sympathies, I believe that Baigent and Leigh placed too much stock in secret historical retentions, by which I mean the concealment and preservation of hidden bloodlines and traditions within highly placed families and social cliques. Frankly, I detect little direct inheritance of esoteric traditions within the contemporary world. History is messy, and family trees, especially family trees of ideas, rarely reach us intact. More common are self-styled secret societies, which pretend to ancient ties and whose acolytes sometimes unknowingly rely on hidden wisdom of no greater vintage than the occult revival of the mid to late 19th century. None of this means that Baigent and Leigh were wrong about lingering and even seismic effects of occult philosophies. Ideas, symbols, practices, and insights not only endure across time, but sometimes form unseen foundations. This is especially true of Freemasonic influences. Do you doubt that? Just look at the back of a dollar bill. The eye and pyramid is not a direct leaf from Masonry, but reflects Masonic philosophy to the core. Material life, the pyramid, is incomplete without the eye of Providence. In the Temple and the Lodge, Baigent and Leigh creditably explore Freemasonic influences on America's framers and revolutionists, a fact of history that most mainstream historians, until recently, underappreciated or overlooked. In the American colonies, fraternity outweighed philosophy. Most colonists did not actually read Locke, Hume, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau any more than most British soldiers did, Baigent and Leigh write. But a significant number of thought leaders, including Washington, Franklin, and Hancock, took vows to Freemasonry. In the agrarian world of the colonies, a landscape largely limited to church, home, and farm, fraternal ties carried outsized influence. Freemasonic ideals, which included religious inclusivism, separation of church and state, and belief in the sanctity of the individual, forged a powerful bond and shared outlook among some of the founders, including a wide range of generals and signers of the Constitution. Baigent and Leigh, in what I consider a stretch, even suggest that Masonic sympathies blunted British commanders' fighting resolve against the colonists. Masonry's history, as well as its influence, is a pastiche with no neat lines, as the authors grasp. One problem is that Freemasons themselves often sought a single coherent heritage, a simple, unaltered skein of tradition extending from pre-Christian times to the present day. In fact, Freemasonry is rather like a ball of twine, ensnarled by a playful kitten. It consists of numerous skeins, which must be disentangled before its various origins can be discerned. In that vein, the authors also probe connections between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, a clandestine thought movement that emerged in Europe in 1614. Calling themselves an invisible college, the Rosicrucians wrote in praise of inner development and mysticism, while prophesying the dawn of a new era of education and enlightenment. There exists a tantalizing confluence of philosophy and timing in the emergence of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. The first obvious literary and journal references to Freemasonry arrived less than a generation later. Shared values between Rosicrucianism and Masonry include radical ecumenism, rejection of aristocratic privilege and theocracy, ennobling of the individual spiritual search, belief in initiatory rites and rituals, use of alchemical and occult symbolism, and a sense of social polity, including the founding of hospitals and free schools. A shared origin between Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry is both tantalizing and reasonable, though still theoretical. It is not even clear that a secret brotherhood of Rosicrucians existed beyond a few manuscripts, which may have been produced by esoteric thinkers and provocateurs who emerged from the final stages of the Renaissance occult revival. This is why I call Rosicrucianism a thought movement, one that may have taken more formalized shape within the lodges of Masonry. The uncertainty of all these threads can be exasperating, but the surrounding questions should be treated patiently. Suppressed groups sometimes go underground and, on occasion, gain the final word through the endurance of their ideas, even when the original persecution was particularly brutal, as with the Templars. The destruction of the Templars in the early 1300s serves as a reminder that powerful institutions often project their flaws onto weaker ones, which allows the powerful to persecute the vulnerable for the former's faults or selfish interests. The Templars played a major role in the Crusades, both financially and martially. But when those conflicts ended in the late 13th century, the Knights' purpose as a combat and financial order was unclear. The French monarchy and the Vatican regarded the Templars as a potential rival. In a push to reassert control over banking and military mechanisms, the papacy decimated the Knights with accusations of heresy, leading to forced confessions, jailing, and in many cases, torture and death. For generations, this kind of religiously sanctioned persecution was directed against many of Europe's outsiders, in particular Jews, accused witches, Romani, and Gnostics. The more lurid accusations against the Templars included infanticide, sexual perversions, ritual abuse, and the worshipping of a disembodied head called Baphomet, later associated with the sabbatic goat and sometimes the figure of Satan. This catalog of accusations got recycled over time, most recently in the satanic abuse scandals that swept the U.S. and England in the 1980s. During the Satanic Panic, everyday people, some with occult ties and tastes, but most with none, got smeared by religionists, local authorities, and self-styled experts with trumped-up charges of ritual and child abuse, in many cases leading to shattered lives and sometimes criminal prosecution. As in earlier eras, it is worth noting the surrounding social circumstances. Traditional institutions, including the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts of America, were denying and underreporting cases of child abuse within their ranks, while defenseless librarians who practiced Wicca had to fear for life and livelihood. One of the historical lessons of the Templars is, whenever a wave of accusation is directed against a marginalized group, look for antecedents within dominant institutions, whose ills often get displaced onto more vulnerable segments of society. This is tragically playing out today in violence against accused witches in economically strained parts of the world. As I write these words during the 2020 pandemic, the need for vigilance is all too clear. Did the Knights Templar fall victim to suppression only to re-emerge as Freemasonry, the most influential esoteric movement of modern life? There is no obvious answer, but Baigent and Leigh's quest highlights a powerful principle: past is never as far from present as it seems. Mitch Horowitz, May 2020. Introduction. In Britain during the last few years, Freemasonry has become both a favorite topic of conversation and a cherished issue of debate. Indeed, Mason baiting bids fair to become something of a full-fledged blood sport here, rather like priest baiting in Ireland. With scarcely disguised exuberance and a virtually audible tally-ho, the newspapers swoop on each new Masonic scandal, each new allegation of Masonic corruption. Church synods ponder the compatibility of Freemasonry with Christianity. In order to goad political opponents, local councils propose motions that would compel Freemasons to declare themselves. At parties, Freemasonry crops up with a frequency exceeded probably only by Britain's intelligence services and the CIA. Television, too, has made its contribution, conducting at least one late-night symposium on the subject and actually managing to poke its cameras into the beast's ultimate lair, Grand Lodge. On failing to find a dragon, the commentators seemed to feel less relief than an aggrieved sulkiness at having somehow been cheated. In the meantime, of course, people have remained fascinated. One need only pronounce the word Freemasonry in a pub, restaurant, hotel lobby, or other public place to see heads twitch, faces swivel attentively, ears fine-tune themselves to eavesdrop. Each new exposé is devoured with an eagerness, even a glee, usually reserved for royal gossip, or for the salacious. This book is not an exposé. It does not address itself to the role or the activities, real or imagined, of Freemasonry in contemporary society. It does not attempt to investigate allegations of conspiracy or corruption. Neither, of course, is it an apology for Freemasonry. We are not Freemasons ourselves, and we have no vested interest in exculpating the institution from the charges leveled against it. Our orientation has been wholly historical. We have endeavored to track down the antecedents of Freemasonry, to establish its true origins, to chart its evolution and development, to assess its influence on British and American culture during its own formative years, culminating with the late 18th century. We have also tried to address the question of why Freemasonry, nowadays so instinctively regarded with suspicion, with derision, with irony and condescension, should ever have come to enjoy the currency it did, and for that matter still does, despite its detractors. In the process, however, we have inevitably been obliged to confront the kind of questions that loom in the public mind today, and are so often posed by the media. Is Freemasonry corrupt? Is it, even more sinisterly, a vast international conspiracy dedicated to some obscure and, if secrecy is a barometer of villainy, nefarious end? Is it a conduit for perks, favors, influence, and power-broking in the heart of such institutions as the city and the police? Most important of all, perhaps, is it truly inimical to Christianity? Such questions are not directly pertinent to the book that follows, but they are of understandable general concern. It will not be inappropriate, therefore, if we offer here the answers to them that emerged in the course of our enquiries. One has attained a measure of wisdom when, instead of exclaiming "et tu, Brute," one nods ruefully and says, "Yes, it figures." Given human nature, it would be surprising if there were not at least some degree of corruption in public and private institutions, and if some of this corruption did not involve Freemasonry. We would argue, however, that such corruption says less about Freemasonry itself than about the ways in which Freemasonry, like any other such structure, can be abused. Greed, self-aggrandizement, favoritism, and other such ills have been endemic to human society since the emergence of civilization. They have availed themselves of, and operated through, every available channel: blood kinship, a shared past, bonds formed in school or in the armed forces, mutual interest, simple friendship, as well, of course, as race, religion, and political affiliation. Freemasonry is accused, for example, of making special dispensations for its own. In the Christianized West, until very recently, a man could expect from his fellows precisely the same special dispensation simply by virtue of his membership in the Freemasonry of Christianity, by virtue, in other words, of not being a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or a Jew. Freemasonry is only one of many channels whereby corruption and favoritism can flourish, but if Freemasonry did not exist, corruption and favoritism would flourish all the same. Corruption and favoritism can be found in schools, in regiments, in corporations, in governmental bodies and political parties, in sects and churches, in innumerable other organizations. None of these is in itself intrinsically reprehensible. No one would think of condemning an entire political party or an entire church because certain of its members were corrupt or more sympathetically disposed towards other members than towards outsiders. No one would condemn the family as an institution because it tends to foster nepotism. In any moral consideration of the matter, it is necessary to exercise an understanding of elementary psychology and a modicum of common sense. Institutions are only as virtuous or as culpable as the individuals who compose them. If an institution can be considered corrupt in any intrinsic sense at all, it can be considered so only if it profits from the corruption of its members. This might apply to, say, a military dictatorship, to certain totalitarian or single-party states, but it is hardly applicable to Freemasonry. No one has ever suggested that Freemasonry ever gained anything through the transgressions of its brethren. On the contrary, the transgressions of individual Freemasons are entirely selfish and self-serving. Freemasonry as a whole suffers from such transgressions, as does Christianity from the transgressions of its adherents. In the question of corruption, then, Freemasonry is not in itself a culprit, but on the contrary, another victim of unscrupulous men who are prepared to exploit it along with anything else for their own ends. A more valid question is the compatibility, or lack thereof, between Freemasonry and Christianity. By its very nature, this question at least implies an attempt to confront what Freemasonry actually is, rather than the ways in which it can be exploited or abused. Ultimately, however, this question, too, is spurious. As is well known, Freemasonry does not purport to be a religion, only to address itself to certain principles or truths, which might in some sense be construed as religious or perhaps spiritual. It may offer a species of methodology, but it does not pretend to offer a theology. This distinction will become clearer in the chapters that follow. For the moment, it will be sufficient to make 2 points in connection with the current antipathy towards Freemasonry on the part of the Anglican Church. Amidst the Church's present preoccupation with Freemasonry in her ranks, these points are generally overlooked. Both are crucial. In the first place, Freemasonry and the Anglican Church have cohabited congenially since the beginning of the 17th century. Indeed, they have done more than cohabited, they have worked in tandem. Most of the important Anglican ecclesiastics of the last 4 centuries have issued from the lodge. Some of the most eloquent and influential Freemasons have issued from the ministry. At no time prior to the last 10 or 15 years has the Church ever inveighed against Freemasonry, ever perceived any incompatibility between Freemasonry and its own theological principles. Freemasonry has not changed. The Church would argue that it has not changed either, at least in its fundamental tenets. Why then, if there has never been any conflict in the past, should there be conflict now? The answer to that question, we would suggest, lies less with Freemasonry than with the attitudes and mentalities of certain contemporary churchmen. The second point worth considering is, if anything, even more decisive. The official head of the Anglican Church is the British monarch. Since James II was deposed in 1688, the monarch's theological status, or credentials, have never been subject to question. And yet, since the beginning of the 17th century, the British monarchy has also been closely involved in Freemasonry. At least 6 kings, as well as numerous princes of the blood and prince consorts, have been Freemasons. Would this be possible if there were indeed some theological incompatibility between Freemasonry and the Church? To argue such incompatibility is tantamount, in effect, to impugning the religious integrity of the monarchy. Ultimately, we would maintain, the current controversy surrounding Freemasonry is a storm in a teacup, a number of non-issues or spurious issues inflated far beyond the status they actually deserve. It is tempting to be flip and suggest that people have nothing better to do than manufacture such tenuous grounds for controversy. Unfortunately, they do have better things to do. Certainly the Anglican Church, with incipient schism in its ranks and a disastrously shrinking congregation, could deploy its energy and resources more constructively than in orchestrating crusades against a supposed enemy, which in fact is not an enemy at all. And while it is perfectly appropriate, even desirable, for the media to ferret out corruption, we would all be better served if the corrupt individuals themselves were called to account, rather than the institution of which they happen to be members. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that Freemasonry itself has done little to improve its own image in the public eye. Indeed, by its obsessive secrecy and its stubborn defensiveness, it has only reinforced the conviction that it has something to hide. How little it does in fact have to hide will become apparent in the course of this book. If anything, it has more to be proud of than it does to conceal. Prelude. 10 years ago, in the spring of 1978, while researching the Knights Templar for a projected television documentary, we became intrigued by the order's history in Scotland. The surviving documentation was meager, but Scotland possessed an even greater wealth of legend and tradition about the Templars than did most other places. There were also some very real mysteries, unexplained enigmas which, in the absence of reliable records, orthodox historians had scarcely attempted to account for. If we could penetrate these mysteries, if we could find even a kernel of truth behind the legends and traditions, the implications would be enormous, not only for the history of the Templars, but extending far beyond as well. A woman we knew had recently moved with her husband to live in Aberdeen. On a visit back to London, they recounted to us a story they had heard from another man who had worked for a time in a hotel in a small tourist community, formerly a Victorian watering spot, on the western shore of Loch Awe in the Highlands of Argyll. Loch Awe is a large inland lake some 25 miles from Oban. The lake itself is 28 miles long and varies in width for the most part from half a mile to a mile. It is dotted with just under 24 islands of various sizes, some natural, others man-made, and formerly connected to the shore by causeways of now submerged stones and timber. Like Loch Ness, Loch Awe is supposed to contain a monster, the Beach Mór, described as a large serpent-like creature with a horse's head and 12 legs sheathed in scales. On one of the islands, according to the story our informant had heard, there were a number of Templar graves, more than would make sense in the context of accepted history, for the Templars were not known to have been active around Argyll or the Western Highlands. On the same island, moreover, there were supposedly the ruins of a Templar preceptory, which did not figure in any of our lists of Templar holdings. As we received it at third hand, the name of the island sounded something like Innis Shield, but we could not be sure of that, still less of the spelling. These fragments of information, even though unconfirmed and frustratingly vague, were tantalizing. Like many researchers before us, we were familiar with nebulous accounts of bands of Templars surviving the official persecution and dissolution of their order between 1307 and 1314. We were familiar with stories that one such enclave of knights, fleeing their tormentors on the continent and in England, had found a refuge in Scotland, and at least for a time had perpetuated something of their original institutions. But we were also aware that most such traditions had originated with the Freemasons of the 18th century, who sought to establish for themselves a pedigree extending directly back to the Templars of 4 centuries before. In consequence, we were extremely skeptical. We knew that no accepted evidence for any Templar survival in Scotland existed, and that even modern Freemasonry tended in general to dismiss all claims to the contrary as sheer invention and wishful thinking. And yet the tale of the island and the lake continued to haunt us. We had planned a research trip to Scotland for that summer anyway, albeit far to the east, Should we not perhaps make a leisurely westward detour, if only to disprove the story we had heard and exorcise it once and for all from our minds? Accordingly, we decided to extend our trip by a few days and return via Argyll. As we descended on Loch Awe from the north, we immediately saw, at the head of it, masked by serried firs,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?